You hear us, Jesus Shepherd, who drives forth Joseph like a flock. From the cherubim will shine forth, rising valor that we be saved. So arise in sight of Ephraim, and Manasseh and Benjamin. God, we pray, oh, turn us, bring us back. Make your face shine, and we are saved.
Good evening. My name is Jason Wallace. I'm the pastor of Christ Presbyterian Church here in the Salt Lake Valley, and we welcome you to another installment of the Ancient Paths. It is good to be back live with you. I was out for several weeks, back visiting family and friends, and then last week was a little bit under the weather. The interview that we did with Grant Palmer, the second part of that, we had some technical difficulties that have hopefully been taken care of, and we hope to have that on our website later this week. All our previous episodes should be on there within a matter of a few weeks. We've been trying to update that and get it caught up. But if you'd like to see any of the ones that we've done before, you can go back and look at www.ancientpaths.tv. Well, before we had the Grant Palmer interview, we had been looking at a survey of the book of Revelation. Now, the reason for that is pretty simple. We have people who are looking at the news and listening to many of the self-appointed Bible teachers out there, and they are commonly saying things like, well, this must be the last days. Jesus must be getting ready to rapture us any time now. We started the year looking at Harold Camping and how he was teaching that the Bible guaranteed that Jesus was coming back May 21st. Now, a lot of people had a good laugh about that, but unfortunately, it was not so funny for others. There was a teenage girl who listened faithfully to Mr. Camping in Russia, and when the time came and went and Jesus had not raptured her away, she was convinced that she was in for this horrible time of persecution and suffering, and she believed that there was no time left for her to be saved, and therefore she killed herself. Mr. Camping had taught her that those who were left behind were going to be annihilated. There was no hell to worry about, and she killed herself. There are people who invested their life savings into the billboard campaigns that we saw all around the valley and throughout the nation, even around the world. And Christianity became a laughingstock. As we've seen in some of our previous episodes, unfortunately, Mr. Camping's not the only one out there. By the way, Mr. Camping now says October 21st is the big day. He has since had a stroke and is not going to be doing the open forum program anymore, but he is still teaching that October 21st is the day, and he's really, really sure this time. Of course, he said he was 99.9999999% sure. That's 9 places to the right of the decimal in his book 1994. This time he didn't even hold out any possibility. He said that the Bible guaranteed it. But now you're supposed to believe him that it's going to be October 21st. As I said, unfortunately, he's not the only one out there teaching this kind of stuff, and there are people who don't know their Bibles. America is woefully ignorant of the Scriptures, and they listen to what other people tell them, and they believe that that is what the Scriptures must say because somebody said it with authority. And unfortunately, there are systems that are just as unbiblical as Camping's. Camping claimed to get it from the Bible. Now, it's not from any clear reading of the Scripture. It's a rejection of the clear reading of the Scripture throughout all of Christian history. Unfortunately, what's popular here in America today, known as dispensationalism, is also not historical and not really biblical in much of what it teaches. We've gone through a host of the distinctions between some of the various groups. There are godly people out there who are just confused on these things, like John MacArthur. There are some people who take these things to heretical lengths, who believe that Pat Robertson taught years ago that Jews get to go to heaven without going through Jesus. All the rest of us, we have to go through Jesus. But Jews, they're God's chosen people, and they don't have to have faith in Christ. Jesus didn't seem to take that view when he was dealing with the Pharisees, but it makes for fun theology for some folks. Well, we started this survey of Revelation, and what I hope that you drew out of this is that the book of Revelation, it is written to real churches. This whole idea that somehow or another these 7 churches are 7 church ages, this is the most fanciful way of reading Scripture that you'll ever find. It goes back to Joachim of Fiore 1,000 years ago, but it's goofy. There were real churches in those real cities, and they received a letter from John telling them that these things were shortly to come to pass. That's verse 1 of chapter 1. They were told that the time was at hand. Now, how would you read a letter like this? When we let the Scriptures speak for themselves, and we take the Scriptures that are maybe not quite so clear and interpret them by the ones that are clear, what we find is that the Bible's not this weird, mysterious book that you need some kind of Ouija board or crystal ball to try to interpret. We've looked at things that fly in the face of this whole convoluted scheme where Jesus says that the resurrection is on the last day. The judgment is on the last day. The picture that Jesus presents is not all this convoluted picture of how we have to rebuild and redestroy the temple so that it can be rebuilt yet again, and all these various things. So much of what people are saying is future has already happened. Doesn't mean that Christ isn't coming back. Christ is coming back. But when he comes back in judgment, and there's the resurrection, and it's the end. It's very simple. What people do is they take chapter 6, which is where we have gotten to in Revelation. They take the Olivet Discourse, which is a parallel of Revelation chapter 6, and they put it off into the future. They say that when Jesus is asked about the destruction of the temple, that this is talking about a rebuilt and redestroyed temple 2 millennia in the distance. The reality is, Jesus says this generation will not pass away until all these things be fulfilled. And guess what? 40 years after Jesus made that promise, the temple was destroyed. Not one stone was left on another. The only thing that is left of the temple is a retaining wall. Not part of the buildings of the temple. Not these grand stones and grand buildings that were being pointed out from the Mount of Olives as Jesus and the disciples are looking down on the Temple Mount. But instead, it is this retaining wall for this great base of earth that was basically built to be this platform for the whole temple complex. That's where the Western Wall, the Wailing Wall, fits into everything. I've heard people say, well, there's still the Wailing Wall. Those stones are not left. There's still stones left on each other. It couldn't have been fulfilled. Wrong. When you read the Olivet Discourse in Matthew 24, Mark 13, Luke 21, what you find is that it is the buildings of the temple or the stones of the temple. These buildings were made out of huge stones. They were a marvel in their day. Now, in order to understand Revelation 6, I have to back up. And I've touched on the Olivet Discourse, but I want to go through it in more detail tonight. Remember the context. We're going to look at Matthew 24 primarily. In Matthew 23, you have this long condemnation given by Jesus against the Pharisees and the scribes. He talks about how they strain a gnat and swallow a camel, how they bind heavy burdens and will not dare lift them with one of their fingers. He goes through and shows their hypocrisy. And then he tells them, you adorn the tombs of the prophets and say, if we had been in the days of our fathers, we would not have been partakers with them in the blood of the prophets. But you bear witness against yourselves, you are the sons of those who kill the prophets. Fill up then the measure of your father's guilt. Just like the wicked husbandmen kill the servants and then eventually kill the son, so they're going to fill up the measure of their father's guilt, that all the righteous blood, Jesus says, from Abel to Zechariah, son of Berechiah, whom you killed between the altar and the temple, may come on this generation. Now you go through Matthew's Gospel, this generation, the Greek word geneia, it's used over and over, and it's referring not to the nation of Israel, as if people are saying, well, Israel's not going to disappear before these things are fulfilled. No, it is talking about the people who were alive at that time. You go through 3 sets of 14 generations at the beginning of Matthew's Gospel, and it's the same word, geneia. Jesus tells the people that the men of Nineveh are going to rise up in the resurrection with the men of this generation, because they preached, or they repented at the preaching of Noah, and one greater than Noah is here. There's the men of Sodom are going to rise up and condemn this generation, because if they had had these privileges, they would have repented long ago in sackcloth and ashes. Over and over, geneia is used for a generation of people, not something referring to long periods afterwards. It is that generation that is going to fill up the measure of their father's guilt, and that guilt is going to be revisited. Luke 21 calls it the days of vengeance. You remember Jesus weeping over Jerusalem, weeping over the city. In Luke's Gospel, he says that if only they knew the things that pertain to their peace, but they're hidden from their eyes. They're going to throw up a bank against them and lay them level to the ground with their children within them. In Matthew's Gospel, he says, Jerusalem, Jerusalem, thou that killest the prophets and stones those who are sent to you. How often I would have gathered your children as a hen gathers her chicks under her wings, but you would not. Behold, your house is left to you desolate. Now remember, that's the whole context of what leads right into Matthew 24. He says, you'll see not my face no more until you say, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. Jesus leaves the temple. And as they go up the Mount of Olives reaches, the path there reaches a point where you can look down and see the Temple Mount. And we're told that the disciples point out these buildings. Matthew 24, verses 1 through 3 says, and Jesus went out and departed from the temple. And his disciples came to him to show him the buildings of the temple. And Jesus said unto them, see ye not all these things? Verily I say unto you, there shall not be left here one stone upon another that shall not be thrown down. And as he sat upon the Mount of Olives, the disciples came unto him privately, saying, tell us, when shall these things be, and what shall be the sign of thy coming and of the end of the world? I don't believe the disciples recognized they were asking two parts of the question there, but when you go through the answer, you'll see that there's two parts. When will these things be, that not one stone is left on another, and the end of the world? You'll see that there is first a whole listing of things with signs and the promise that this generation won't pass away. But of that day knows no man. There's no signs. It comes like in the days of Noah. They're eating and drinking until Noah goes into the ark. It's like a thief in the night. On the one hand, you're supposed to prepare and you're supposed to flee. There's no fleeing from the end of the world. But I want to look at the first part of this. When we go through the Olivet Discourse, and we're going to see how that parallels Revelation 6. Honestly, I believe that much of Revelation is John's version of this Olivet Discourse. It parallels it over and over. And it's talking about the destruction of Jerusalem in that generation. Now, Revelation goes on to talk about what happens afterwards. How the gospel goes out through the whole world. How there's a final judgment. How there is the New Jerusalem and all these things. But so many times people take what has already been fulfilled and try to get some double fulfillment out of it. We have people, the Seventh-day Adventists, their whole movement, and the Jehovah's Witnesses, they all come out of the Millerites. William Miller looked at Daniel 9, where it's talking about the 70 weeks in the King James translation. And he says, aha, a week, a prophetic day is a year. So he goes back a chapter and he ignores the fact that Daniel 8, when it talks about the time from Antiochus Epiphanes sacrificing a pig in 168 on the altar of the temple in Jerusalem, 168 BC, that you have 2,300 days, literally 2,300 mornings and evenings, and there's a little bit of debate about whether it's morning and evening sacrifices, so 1,150 days or 2,300 days. But he says, this isn't the rededication of the temple like everyone has always understood. No, no, no. This is 2,300 years. And he comes up with the magic year of 1843. That doesn't work out so well. Then he comes up with 1844. The Seventh-day Adventists still stick to that 1844. They just say Jesus came back invisibly in investigative judgment. And the Jehovah's Witnesses just kept adding years. First they added 30 years, then 70 years. Then they just kept on going from there. And they've set, I want to say, somewhere around a dozen to 2 dozen dates that have come and gone, and yet people still follow them. When you take something that is prophecy, that has been fulfilled, and say, no, it must yet be fulfilled, you're confusing God's Word, and you're confusing yourself. When people look around and they see there's wars and rumors of wars, this must be the end. It unfortunately all too often in America justifies people being lazy, being irresponsible, figuring they don't have to do the hard work of actually discipling their children because, hey, we're not going to be around for much longer. When you realize that people thought that 200 years ago, and 400 years ago, and 1,000 years ago, and on back, there have been people who have twisted the Scriptures, ignore the clear meaning of Scripture, and tried to have double fulfillments and all these convoluted things, and they confuse themselves, and unfortunately all too often provide themselves with a pretext for being unfaithful. Now, to a great extent, in terms of end times, if you're clear that Jesus is coming back and that He's going to judge the world, and you're going to be faithful doing what He's told you until the end, a lot of this is just gravy. But most people don't do that. Most people either they think that Jesus' return is so far off they don't have to worry, or it's so close they don't have to worry about doing anything else. They can do like the Harold Camping guys and sell all their stuff, go out in a camper around the world and tell people that Jesus is coming back tomorrow, or the next day, or October 21st, or maybe October 21st next year, or who knows. When will these things be? Jesus tells them. In verses 4 and 5, and Jesus answered and said to them, take heed that no man deceive you. For many shall come in my name, saying, I am Christ, and shall deceive many. There are a host of false Christ that appear between 30 AD, when Jesus says this, and 70 AD, the destruction of the temple. You have, according to Josephus, in his Antiquities of the Jews, he says, the country was full of robbers, magicians, false prophets, false messiahs, and impostors who deluded the people with promises of great events. They were everywhere. There was Theudas. There was I think Simeon the Egyptian, and a host of others. And they were claiming to be the Messiah who was going to they were going to deliver the Jews from the Roman oppression. Jesus says, don't be deceived. The second part, Matthew 24, verse 6. And ye shall hear of wars and rumors of wars. See that ye be not troubled, for all these things must come to pass, but the end is not yet. Now that sounds familiar to many of us, and we don't stop to think about it. When has there been a period in human history when there has not been war? When war has been uncommon, at least. There are some who read this as, well, there's going to be seed time and harvest, the sun's going to go up, the sun's going to go down, there's going to be wars and rumors of wars, and it's just describing this extreme length of time. I don't think that's the context, because remember, Jesus says this generation will not pass away until these things be fulfilled. We're in the middle, at this point, of the Pax Romana, the peace of Rome, as it was known. It was an unprecedented 200-year period of peace in the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire had the might to enforce its will to a great extent. By the time that you have the destruction, between 30 AD and 70 AD, Pax Romana blows apart. You have even Roman historians like Tacitus saying it seemed as if the world was going to end. You had the death of, Nero burns Rome and blames the Christians for it in 64 AD. You have the beginning of the Jewish War, and then you just have all kinds of mayhem. When you get into the Jewish War, Vespasian lays siege to Jerusalem for a second time. I forget who the first general was that came up against them, but Vespasian comes up, lays siege to the city, finds out that Nero's died, and there's a civil war raging in Rome. The death of Nero was the death of the end of the Julian Caesars. He was the last lineal descendant of Julius Caesar to be in charge of the Roman Empire. Vespasian has to leave Jerusalem, break the siege, go back to Rome, and basically solidify his power, and then ends up sending Titus to finish the job. Wars and rumors of wars. That's what we're going to see in Revelation 6 next week when we get more into that, but we have to lay the foundation for it. There's war coming. The four horsemen of the apocalypse in Revelation 6. What do they bring? They bring war. They bring pestilence. They bring judgment. Jesus says the end is not yet. So don't be confused by these things. There's more to come. For nation shall arise, and this is verses 7 and 8, for nation shall rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom. And there shall be famines and pestilences and earthquakes in divers places. All these are the beginnings of sorrows. Once again, is this really giving us a firm road sign, a mile marker as we're progressing towards some definite destination. There's always been famines. There's famines around the world right now. There are famines all through human history. But in context here, Rome had been very stable and very blessed with all kinds of abundance. There hadn't been famines for a great period of time. But in Acts 11, verse 28, we're told that there was a special famine that took place in this very time period between Jesus' promise that the generation would not pass away in 30 AD and 70 AD with the destruction of Jerusalem. Acts 11:28 says, "Then one of them named Agabus stood up and showed by the Spirit that there was going to be a great famine throughout all the world, which also happened in the days of Claudius Caesar." Claudius, remember, is the immediate predecessor of Nero, I believe his uncle. And so this is right in that time period. There was a great famine, just as Jesus had promised that there would be. This blowing apart of the Pax Romana, the peace of Rome, the famines, all these various things. The Christians understood it. According to Eusebius, who writes his ecclesiastical history in the 4th century AD, he's looking back at what happened in the early centuries of the church. He's writing this, I think, roughly 350 AD. Eusebius writes that based on this Olivet Discourse, the Christians recognized that Jerusalem was doomed and left Jerusalem. The Jews had killed many Christians, they'd persecuted and they had killed some. But when the Romans came, they left. If you followed the instructions that Jesus gives in this 24th chapter of Matthew, you got out. Because when you go through Josephus, what you find is these two abortive attempts to lay siege to Jerusalem. First by a general whose name I can't recall at the moment, the other by Vespasian. These generals laid waste to the outlying areas, and the Jews retreat into Jerusalem, and then these foreign Roman armies just go away. And according to Josephus, who was there, who was in the midst of all of this, Josephus said that they came to believe that God was divinely protecting them and that Jerusalem could never be violated. They were convinced that Jerusalem was their safe haven and that they need never fear so long as they stayed in Jerusalem. And yet, as Josephus himself admits, it was a delusion, and it helped bring about their own destruction. The Christians were told that when, Luke 21, when you see the armies surrounding Jerusalem, know her devastation is near. And so we're going to talk about that. We're going to keep pressing through this Olivet Discourse to help us have the proper foundation as we're surveying Revelation in general and Revelation 6 in particular. But I want to go ahead and open up the phone lines and have a conversation on this. The phone number here is 801-973-TV20. That's 801-973-8820. What are your views? If you believe in the pre-trib rapture, call us. I'd like to talk about it. The pre-trib rapture was not held by anyone in the Christian church prior to the year 1830. Some people can argue about pseudo-Ephraim. We can talk about that a little bit if you like, but this comes about in the 19th century, and it comes about from one of the most schismatic, nutty groups of so-called Christians that you would ever want to meet. We've talked in the past about John Nelson Darby. He was not a very godly man. He was a very legalistic, very nasty individual. He He excommunicated people by his word. There was no accountability. He joined this group called the Plymouth Brethren, where they were supposed to all be equal, but like on Animal Farm, some animals are more equal than others. He ends up being basically the Pope. And Dispensationalism really didn't catch on that quickly because they were associated with this schismatic fringe group. And it's really only in the late 19th century and then into the early 20th century, the creation of the Scofield Reference Bible, that it really takes root and then grows dramatically in the 1930s and 40s during the whole fundamentalist modernist debate. But anyway, let's go back to Matthew 24. We've gotten through verse 8, and the next thing that we're promised is that there are going to be false Christ, wars and rumors of wars. There's going to be famine. All these are the beginnings of sorrows. There are going to be earthquakes. There were earthquakes. There was an earthquake. There were numerous ones. There was a severe one in Pompeii leading up to the destruction of Pompeii and Herculaneum. But the Roman historians record that these were very unusual in their strength and frequency. People look at what's happened in Christchurch in New Zealand or at the earthquake in Sendai, Japan, and they say, this must be the fulfillment. They've been saying that with every earthquake that seems to ever happen, because they ignore the context. This generation will not pass away until all these things be fulfilled. We have seen these people try to gather a following with the San Francisco earthquake back in the 80s and all the various others. Jesus isn't giving us some amorphous, weird kind of prophecy here. It's not like trying to make out shapes in clouds. He's describing very, very accurately the things that are going to lead up to the destruction of Jerusalem. And it is verified, some in the scriptures, as we saw in Acts 11, but also in Josephus, and also in the Roman historians themselves, who are recounting all the earthquakes, the political turmoil. It seemed as if the whole world was coming apart. And this is according to pagan Romans. All right, so then verse 9 and following. Then they shall deliver you up to be afflicted, and shall kill you, and ye shall be hated of all nations for my name's sake. And then shall many be offended, and shall betray one another, and shall hate one another. And many false prophets shall rise, and shall deceive many. And because iniquity shall abound, the love of many shall wax cold. But he that shall endure unto the end shall be saved. Now, all through the book of Acts, we see there's persecution of the church. We see the conversion of Saul of Tarsus as he's making his way to Damascus. What? To persecute the church. You have this wonderful period of peace and unity immediately following Pentecost, but soon afterwards it is disrupted by persecution. You have the killing of James, the brother of John. You have the stoning of Stephen even before that. But all through the book of Acts, it is the unbelieving Jews who are following Paul from city to city, stirring them up, trying to have him killed, making accusation, having him thrown into prison, accusing him at every turn. They're the ones that, when he goes into the temple at the end of his third missionary journey, stir up the people, saying he's brought Gentiles into the temple. The Romans, all through the book of Acts, are at worst neutral. The Romans are very pragmatic. They don't care whether you worship Jesus. They don't care whether you worship a hole in the ground. They see this as one more squabble within Judaism. You've got the Pharisees, you've got the Sadducees, you've got the Essenes, you've got all these various groups of Jews, the Romans don't want to be worried with it. All the Romans are caring about at that point is that they want peace. They don't want anyone to disturb the peace. And so the Romans end up protecting the church to some extent. You remember Gallio, the brother of Seneca, how he is, I forget the term, that he was in Corinth and the Jews make accusation and they are driven from the judgment seat there. You have this protection that holds in place until 64 AD, as I mentioned earlier. Then you have Nero, and according to Tacitus and others, the Roman historians who are contemporary in all this, they believe that it was probably Nero himself who burned the city, because Nero just happened to have all these wonderful plans for taking over the center part of the city and building a palace beyond anyone's dreams in terms of opulence. And he already seemed to have the plans before the city burned. Well, when the city burns, he blames the Christians. And Nero makes a proclamation that is not rescinded until Constantine, in the beginning of the 4th century, that makes it illegal for 250 years for you to be a Christian in the Roman Empire on penalty of death. The Romans didn't always follow that. There were various organized persecutions, but at any point, a Roman soldier could come up to you and kill you if you did not say that Caesar was Lord. Now, most of them didn't do that. They didn't pursue that, but Nero then turns the Roman Empire against the church. And you know the stories. Christians were fed to the lions, not in the Colosseum at that point. Colosseum, ironically, is built with funds from the plunder of Jerusalem, specifically taking the gold of the temple in Jerusalem. But in the Circus Maximus, which predated the Colosseum, they were feeding Christians to the lions. They were sowing them in sacks with wild animals. They were doing unspeakable things to them. They were burning them alive, and they were doing all kinds of other horrible, horrible things. Well, what happens? Christians begin to fall away. We'll talk about more of that, at least professing Christians begin to fall away. We'll come back to that in a moment, but I want to go ahead and take our first call. We have Mike from Draper with us. Mike, good to have you with us.
Good evening. I'll jump right into my questions here.
Okay.
If I'm looking at Matthew 24, and I'm down to about verse 29. So
okay.
If this great tribulation then is the destruction of Jerusalem, from verse 29 on, it seems to make it sound like that then Jesus comes right back after that's done then. Could you go over that?
Sure.
And then if you have time to, you might be doing this in a later episode, but the parable of the fig tree, because I've heard lots of different stuff on that. So
okay.
If you can go over any of that, that'd be cool.
Sure.
Thank you very much.
Not a problem at all. We're going to be getting there in just a moment. I'm not going to avoid this in any way because I think it is vitally important. That is the section that Mike's just pointing to that leads many people to believe, well, this couldn't have happened in 70 AD. But when you let Scripture interpret Scripture, you find out it actually does fit with it happening then. So we'll press home, but if you'd like to join in the conversation, the phone number here is 801-973-TV20. That's 801-973-8820. We're talking about the Olivet Discourse, specifically Matthew 24. You also find it in Mark 13 and Luke 21. And all this is basically a lead-in for Revelation chapter 6, because without understanding the Olivet Discourse, you really don't have a basis on which to judge the other. We're going to get to that passage in a moment, but let's lead up to it. So you've got Christians being persecuted, and there is an apostasy. Not a total apostasy, not a loss of the authority of the church, none of these things that you often hear. But there is an apostasy where many people begin to fall away. Many people begin to try to redefine Christianity to where one of the things that's required by Caesar is that you worship him. See, Judaism was a protected religion. Everyone else in the empire had to worship Caesar, but Jews were exempt. They were a recognized, legitimate, legal religion, and members of Judaism were not required to worship Caesar. And because they knew that would go too far, that would bring about war. So as long as Christians were recognized as a sect of Judaism, they were protected. That protection was taken away in 64 AD. Then you had to worship Caesar. Now you could worship Jesus too, but you had to burn incense to the genius of Caesar. You had to worship Caesar as a god. And we see in the book of Hebrews the temptation that Christians at that time had. They had not yet suffered to the point of death yet. But here are these Jewish Christians. They're ethnically Jewish. They are being tempted to go back to Judaism. Why? Because Judaism was still protected. What seemed to be a clear black and white choice, they tried to find middle ground. See, if you continue to be faithful to Christ, you could very easily be put to death. And not just you, your children, your wife, before your very eyes, in unspeakable, horrible ways. Or you could worship Nero as a god. Nero, the beginning of his reign was considered to be a great thing by many people at the time, because he was being restrained by others who were ruling for him. He was a young man. But when he took the throne, even the Romans began to call him the beast. He would literally dress up as an animal and go into the Circus Maximus and attack, and I'm trying to be delicate here, but he would attack and molest people in every imaginable way, dressed as an animal. He was trying to think of polite terms for this, but basically he killed his own mother. He stomped his pregnant wife to death. His first wife, whom he dearly loved, who had died, he missed greatly, and he found a prepubescent boy that greatly resembled her and had him surgically changed and married him. The joke among the Romans was, oh, that Nero's father had had such a wife. He was a vile, nasty, horrible man. He was completely given over to lust and cruelty, and the Senate, everyone was afraid of him. You could either follow Christ and die, or worship him as a god. As you can expect, a lot of people try to say, is there some third way here? And that's the temptation in the book of Hebrews. They want to go back to Judaism. Judaism, you can worship God, right? You can go to the temple, you can sing the Psalms, you can do all these various things, and isn't that good enough? No, that's the answer. No, it's not. You have to stay faithful. There's warnings. I mean, can you imagine the temptation to abandon the fellowship during this time of persecution? If you know that going to a Christian meeting can lead you to being killed, having your children fed to animals, being fed alive to some dog before cheering thousands, are you going to be anxious to go to worship? There's all kinds of stresses in that kind of persecution. You have some people that are very outspoken, that other people fear because they're afraid that they're bringing unnecessary attention to them, to the group, and they're going to lead to everybody being killed. There are going to be some people who think that others are being too timid. There's going to be this temptation to have your love grow cold in the midst of all this. Jesus is warning them. What does Paul tell them in Hebrews? Do not forsake the assembling of yourselves together. What does that say about modern American Christians who make up every lame excuse about why they shouldn't be in worship on the Lord's Day? If you were supposed to go, even if it was a matter of life and death, thinking that somehow or another you're going to fellowship better fishing is not a great excuse. But anyway, let's press on so we can get to the harder portions here. It says, in this gospel of the kingdom, this is verse 14, shall be preached in all the world for a witness unto all nations, and then shall the end come. People say, well, obviously they didn't preach the gospel in Papua New Guinea. They didn't preach it on Easter Island yet. Therefore, this can't be referring to the first century. That is, until you let Scripture interpret Scripture. The Apostle Paul says in Colossians chapter 1 that not only have they heard, has the gospel come to the Colossians, but has gone throughout the whole world. Context. The faith of the Romans is spoken of throughout the whole world. I don't think this precludes the obvious reading that not one stone was left on another in 70 A.D. So verses 15 and following. When ye therefore see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet stand in the holy place, whoso readeth, let him understand. Then let them which be in Judea flee into the mountains. Let him which is on the housetop not come down to take anything out of his house. Neither let him which is in the field return back to take his clothes. And woe unto them that are with child, and to them that give suck in those days. But pray ye that your flight be not in the winter, neither on the Sabbath day. For then shall be great tribulation, such as was not since the beginning of the world to this time, no, nor ever shall be. Now remember the context here. All this is before the gathering of the elect. These are all these warnings. Now many would have us believe that without warning, there's going to be this pre-trib rapture of the church. And yes, the Bible does teach we're going to be caught up to meet Jesus, and we've dealt with this. It doesn't mean that there's this intervening period. And we can deal with that a little more next week when we get more into chapter 6 of Revelation. But the whole focus here is flee. Be prepared. Know when you see these things coming. Now, the abomination of desolation, many people try to make this some strange mystical thing. Well, what was the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet? It is the desecration of the temple under Antiochus Epiphanes, nearly 200, roughly 200 years earlier. Remember, Matthew's writing to a Jewish audience. Luke is writing to a Gentile audience. Luke doesn't use this language about the abomination of desolation. Instead, what he says is that when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, know that her desolation is near. That happens. Now the funny thing is, there are some dispensationalists who say that Luke 21, which parallels Matthew 24 and Mark 13, point for point. Well, that Luke 21 is talking about 70 AD, but Matthew's talking entirely about something else. No. Luke is using what a Gentile audience would understand. And in terms of not fleeing on the Sabbath day, why? Well, we know from the Old Testament that the city gates were closed on the Sabbath. There are a host of other things that I think we can flesh out a little more next week, but I wanted to press on to verses 29 and 30 because that's what our caller Mike was asking about. It says, immediately after the tribulation of those days shall the sun be darkened, and the moon shall not give her light, and the stars shall fall from heaven, and the powers of the heaven shall be shaken. And then shall appear the sign of the Son of Man in heaven, and then shall all the tribes of the earth mourn, and they shall see the Son of Man coming in the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. Now, if you don't know the Old Testament, which the dispensationalists don't teach much from the Old Testament unless it's Zechariah or Daniel, by and large. There are exceptions, thankfully, but if you don't know the Old Testament, that seems like it's talking about something that must be the second coming. That must be the end of the world. But remember, everything that we've covered tonight is framed by this passage in verse 34, where it says, this generation shall not pass away until all these things be fulfilled. When we go back to the Old Testament, we find that the language that's being used here is language that was used for the destruction of Babylon 600 years earlier, and it wasn't the end of the world. In Isaiah chapter 13, we're going to look at verse 1 for context, and then because of our shortness of time, we'll press on to verse 9. But Isaiah 13, beginning at verse 1, the burden against Babylon, which Isaiah the son of Amos saw. So very clearly dealing with Babylon, and we'll press on. Verse 9, behold, the day of the Lord comes, cruel with both wrath and fierce anger, to lay the land desolate, and he will destroy its sinners from it. For the stars of heaven and their constellations will not give their light. The sun will be darkened in its going forth, and the moon will not cause its light to shine. Now, when you read Isaiah 13, and I believe you read any competent commentator, you will find that it is talking about the destruction of the literal city of Babylon. Remember, Isaiah is writing long before this, about 700 years before Christ. Israel is taken into captivity in Babylon, and Babylon is destroyed by the Medes and the Persians. And you have, with the rise of Cyrus, you have the release of the Jews, they go back to the Promised Land, all these various things. This is talking about the literal city of Babylon and its literal destruction 600 years before Christ, and it's using this apocalyptic language. I don't want to simply say poetic, because sometimes people understand that as somehow undermining the reality of what's taking place here. But there is language in Scripture that is used that is to portray the spiritual reality of what's taking place. Here in the destruction of Jerusalem, the stars of heaven and their constellations will not give their light. The sun will be darkened in its going forth, and the moon will not cause its light to shine. You compare that to Matthew 24, verses 29 and 30. You have, immediately after the tribulation of those days shall the sun be darkened, and the moon shall not give her light, and the stars shall fall from heaven, and the powers of the heavens shall be shaken. I think they're very, very close. Remember what we see later on in Revelation in terms of the judgment that's taking place on Jerusalem. They have broken God's covenant, and the curses of the covenant are coming on them. The two witnesses are killed in that great city that is spiritually called Sodom and Egypt, where also our Lord was crucified. Jerusalem, the faithful city, has become a harlot, just like in Isaiah 1. And the judgment of God is coming upon them. In terms of coming on the clouds, once again, this is judgment language straight out of the Old Testament, where there it did not talk about the end of the world. Isaiah 19:12, The burden against Egypt. Behold, the Lord rides on a swift cloud, and will come into Egypt. The idols of Egypt will totter at his presence, and the heart of Egypt will melt in its midst. I will set Egyptians against Egyptians. God is judging the Egyptians. Here he's judging Israel. Just like in Habakkuk, he's bringing the Babylonians against the people of Israel. So now he's going to be bringing the Romans against them. And so when we let Scripture interpret Scripture, there's absolutely nothing here that prevents us from taking at face value the statement, this generation will not pass away until all these things be fulfilled. Because as we've seen, what happens when the wicked husbandmen kill the son? The master of the vineyard will destroy those murderers. That's what we see. We'll flesh this out more next week and get more into the Revelation 6. I hope this is making sense out of a whole bunch of craziness out there. This show is sponsored by Christ Presbyterian Church. We hold to the same faith that the church has held to through most of her history. We believe the Bible to be our only infallible rule of faith and practice. We invite you to worship with us Sunday mornings at 11 a.m., Sunday evenings at 5:30 p.m. at 8630 West, 2700 South. We also have a sister congregation, Berean Presbyterian Church, that meets at 9 a.m. at 3350 Harrison Boulevard in Ogden. We are part of the Orthodox Presbyterian Church. We are not part of the mainline Presbyterian Church USA, but we hold to the faith once for all delivered to the saints. We believe that Christ is ruling and reigning, and that rather than being confused by all these self-appointed Bible teachers, we need to go back to the Scriptures, back to the historic faith of the church, and back to Jesus Christ. Until we see you next week, we wish the Lord's greatest blessings. Good night.